So, like I said, we're going to begin with Esther 3. And this is where we left off in the Book of Esther, covering the background, chapters 1 and 2. And I also kind of asked everyone to, if they could, read ahead throughout the chapter or throughout the whole book, and to see how the story progresses so that we can have a little more insight into where we're going. It helps to know the story and what's going to happen, to be able to perhaps better analyze and see what's going on in the scening, in the setting, a certain scene, as we go through verse by verse. So let's go ahead and get started now. Esther 3. So in Esther 3, it's another 4 to 5 years later. We'll see down in verse 7, and we'll go over it when we get there as well again. But as we were mentioning before, Esther has in it a chronology, and it gets us a little bit more insight knowing when these things happen. So it's not just we're gonna put this there just because we have nothing else better to do. And sort of like some history tests that we take sometimes. It's about the dates. Well, very seldom is it about the dates, but these do give us a certain amount of perspective in terms of what's going on, and helps us to see some of these things a little bit better. So again, we'll touch on that a little bit later in verse 7. So let's begin in Esther 3 and verse 1. It says, "After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him." So now we're introduced to the bad guy, the antagonist in the story, Haman. And again, this is a part in Jewish plays where, and again, they typically reenact this whole story at this time of the year. In fact, it was Purim on the previous 2 days to the Sabbath, that when the name Haman is said, or whenever it comes up, I believe everybody hisses and they make these noises, and it's kind of, I think, tantamount to what we typically do in terms of booing. So he's the bad guy. This goes without saying, and it's understatement of just how bad this guy is. But what we see here is that he has a very high position. And even at this point in the story, he's above all the princes, all the other nobles, all these people in the empire. And it appears that he's only number 2 to the actual king himself. So at this point, it's unclear whether he actually could be considered the vizier or the prime minister of the place. But definitely as we go on, we'll see that for sure he occupies a similar position as a kind of head of state, that only second to the king, that allows him the ability to do a lot of the things that he wants to do, or that he is wrongly inspired to do. Now, the other interesting thing here is that it mentions him as an Agagite. Now, it's not completely clear what an Agagite is. Now, there's 2 suppositions. One is that it's an area, Agag is an area within the Persian Empire, which again was quite extensive if you remember. Or 2, it was a descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites. And as we will see, it could possibly be a concatenation of the 2 of those together, that it was actually both. And it's not outside the realm of possibility for it actually to be both, because the Agag is actually found in certain inscriptions, older ancient inscriptions, as a place in Persia. And of course, we know of Agag the Amalekite from the Bible. In 1 Samuel 15, in fact, there's an encounter with Saul. Now, it's interesting in that encounter, though, Saul was tasked with going out and killing all of the Amalekites in this specific area, this city of Amalek, as they called it. And instead of doing exactly as he was told, not only was he supposed to kill all the people, but he was also supposed to kill all the livestock. Well, it come to find out, he leaves the King Agag, alive, as well as a lot of the livestock. And of course, he blames that on the people. But at the end of the day, the story is that he did not follow God's specific instructions. And because of that, God more or less said, okay, I'm done with you there's going to be somebody better than you that I'm going to replace you with. And so, of course, he's saying this all through Samuel. But again, Samuel was grieved by this whole process, and he that was it. I mean, after this was the last time that Samuel, who was the last of the what would you call it, the judges before the kings, and he was a prophet, that again, that he was very, very closely in touch with the king. This was the last time that he talked to him, and last time he actually saw him, until actually King Saul had died. So what we have here, though, is that, again, without getting into why this all happened, and the justification of why God has to be justified before man in terms of why this slaughter happened, nonetheless, we find that the Amalekites were the mortal enemies of Israel. So they were the ones that attacked the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They ambushed them. And again, you can read, and I recommend reading 1 Samuel 15, and you can see that. But they didn't stop right there, and they continued to be this thorn in their side, and God says, okay, we want to take care of them because they did what they did. And the Amalekites were descendants of Edom, or Esau, and so you even see some of this, probably this consternation going back to even the time of Jacob and Esau between the two of them. It goes that far back, but it keeps raising its ugly head. David had to deal with them there at the end of 1 Samuel. I think it was chapter 30. He deals with them at the beginning of even 2 Samuel. And then in 1 Chronicles 4, we talk about, or the Bible talks about, the sons of Simeon having to deal with the Amalekites. And I would dare say, even till this day, this infighting and this hatred between the two still exists even in the modern Middle East. And it's why we see a lot of these problems. So there's always this persistent, constant conflict between Israel, or at this time Judah, because Israel went to captivity and then dispersed. And so it was between Judah and the Amalekites that always went on. And it was this, I think, whether it was just from the days of the Amalekites, or if it went all the way back to Jacob and Esau, what we're finding here, I believe, is a continuation of the problems that started a long time ago. And it explains why, we'll get to some of the things in the next few verses as to why these problems were, or why this became such a big problem in the book of Esther. So just to recap, if you go back all the way time to, say, the time of Abraham, which was like around 2000 BC, so you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you have the conflict there, and then you have Moses, which is about another 500 years later, 1500 BC, where he's coming out of Egypt and the Amalekites are attacking. And then you have these are approximate, King David around 1000 BC, and you have him and Saul having to deal with the Amalekites. And then here we are approximately another 500 years later, after the fall of the Babylonian Empire and the beginning of the Persian Empire, that this problem rears itself up yet again. So if we understand then who they were back then perhaps we have a little more insight into who they are at the time of the story of Esther, as well as who they might be today. So let's continue in verse 2 of Esther 3. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. So we have this conflict, because what the king says, as you will remember, is law. And here it is, Mordecai is insisting on this aspect of the law, and it is bothering him greatly, as we'll see. So the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" So this is how Haman is going to try to get his way with not only Mordecai, but all the Jews in general. And this kind of goes back to what we're saying then. If he was of the Amalekites, then what we're seeing here is an ongoing problem that is only exacerbated by the fact that Mordecai will not bow to Haman, even though the king has said, okay, he's not saying the Jews have to bow to the Amalekites, but he says because Haman is in such a high position that Mordecai and all the others would have to bow to him. Now it happened when they spoke to him daily, he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman. So again, he's saying, look, I'm not going to do this for whatever reason. Again, we're not going to get into the specifics of what the reason may be, whether it was this or whether it was some other thing, because you can hypothesize all these things, and it's not told, it's not said in the actual Book of Esther why he did not bow. But suffice it to say, he did not, and in doing so, he broke the king's command as well. So Mordecai would not listen, so they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. So now it's understood, and even further back, that Mordecai was a Jew. But as we will recall, Esther kept it quiet that she was a Jew, and nobody actually knows that at this point in time, save Mordecai in terms of the story. Now, so when Haman saw Mordecai did not pay or bow homage to him, Haman was filled with wrath. And so we see how all this could easily play into that history. Verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So for some reason he thought better of it, but that did not stop him from plotting and planning. For they had told him of the people of Mordecai. So instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, not just Mordecai. So all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai, the Jews. So it really does seem to be that there is something underlying in this situation. You don't just go from somebody not bowing to you to saying, okay, I'm going to kill not only Mordecai, but everybody who is like him or related to him. I mean, this would be the ultimate act of racism. And of course, it was a type of racism, if it was indeed that not only did he have this hatred for Mordecai, and this was what was really getting at him, but if he actually knew, and he was a Amalekite, that he was a Jew, and that all these other Jews would then, and it was a plot by him, that he would be able to take vengeance on them for all the past conflicts, atrocities, the wars, the things that they had gone through. So again, like I said, it would be a big jump to say, okay, not only am I going to kill Mordecai and all the Jews, and all the Jews, if there was not some type of underlying history. So we're beginning to see that Haman was a tool of Satan. Now, Satan has always gone a long way to destroy the people of God. So this is not a far stretch to see that he would be using Haman yet once again to try to destroy the Jews. Because if he could destroy God's people, okay, which again wasn't ever going to happen, but if he could, in whatever demented thought process he has, then that would mean that Jesus could not be born. He could not become the savior of mankind because he had to come from a Jewish lineage as was prophesied. So if Satan could kill all the Jews, again, he wanted to just kill them anyway because they were quote unquote God's people, then, okay, if he could, kill all of them, then he'd be a long way towards trying to succeed in thwarting the plan of God. So now I think we're beginning at this point in the picture to see why God inspired Mordecai not to let Esther tell everyone she was a Jew. Now, we're not told why Mordecai said it, but what we can see is that God had inspired it to this end. So God had something that he was working out, and he knew what Satan's intentions were. He knew how he would use Haman. He knew how Haman's part in all of this. And this is the way that God inspired it and orchestrated it to happen. So let's look at the other side. If Haman had known that Esther was a Jew, would he have proceeded in the fashion that he did? would he have gone to do the things he had done, or that what he was trying to implement? And would God then have reacted or been able to act in the way that God would act and deliver the Jews? And the answer to that, I think, is simply no. Because had he known that the queen, the king's wife, was a Jew, do you think that he would have been that, naive or silly or ignorant to actually say, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and kill all the Jews, knowing good and well that Esther was one? No. And so I think it all plays together as to why, Esther did not say. And again, to reiterate the point too at the time, is that if we would have known why Mordecai did it, then perhaps we would not be so willing to look at, or so able to look at, why or what God was doing. Perhaps we would miss that and not see that. So it becomes, in terms of inspired word of God and scripture, it becomes less of an issue that we actually need to know why these things had happened. Rather, we need to see that God is working throughout the book of Esther, even though his name is not mentioned. So let's continue to Esther 3 and verse 7. Esther 3 and verse 7. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Pur, that is, the lot, before Haman to determine the day, the month, until it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So, as we said before, this is 4 to 5 years after Queen Esther was made queen. And what we find here is now Haman, the evil Haman, devising a plan using Pur, or Purim, where the name Purim comes from. Pur is singular. Purim, I-M, means multiple, or like the S in English. So what we have here is Haman using Pur, and I don't even know exactly how this is used, but suffice it to say that it has godly uses and ungodly uses. Right? We see in the Bible that that lots were cast for the apostle to replace Judas Iscariot. Also, we saw that lots were cast for Jesus's garments. And then we also see here in this situation that lots were used in a wrong divine way, to come up with a date for this attack that Haman had in mind on the Jews. So even though it was ungodly, nonetheless, God had his hand in it in terms of the timing and the way he was working things out. So it's interesting here that when you read this, if you read it carefully, it says, before Haman to determine the day and the month. All right, so they were casting lots, however they were casting, until they found the day. So assuming that there's 30 days, give or take, in a month, they had to cast it a number of times before they got the day. And then for the month, they kept casting it until it came up to the 12th month. So I'm presuming that they did this in order. So that meant that they would actually have to throw the lots or the dice, something, again, that's what I always kind of think of, something similar to throwing a die or dice, is that when you throw it, somehow it indicates one way or the other that this is a yes or it's a no. So they cast it, and they had to cast it 12 times, so they came to the 12th month. So again, what are the odds that it comes up no, all the way until the 12th month, and then, the same for the days until the day that it was. So it does appear to be that God had his hand in that as well, even though they were beseeching some other god. And it's also said that it was, this is in the first month that they did this, was also the time of the year that in some of the pagan religions that gods would get together and decide the destiny of man. So here they are in the first month appealing to these pagan gods as to, when is the best time for us to, again, put into action our evil plan. So I had to kind of laugh there, because you're asking God to do evil. What kind of God is it that you have that you believe he's going to reward you with the things that you're asking in terms of evil. So I think just by the odds alone, we see God's hand in it and the timing of it. So continuing in verse 8 of chapter 3, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there are certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdoms. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. So here we have Haman. He's not given the whole story, obviously, of what he wants to do and how they differed, and the fact that they were more than likely keeping almost all the laws that they could, and they were getting along. But nonetheless, the Jews throughout history, because they've had God's law, have stood out and been separate from everybody else because it is God's law. So whether anybody perhaps thought themselves righteous, or because it was this kind of this mirror reflecting back at them that the Jews said, okay, we're not going to do this wrong thing, but you're going to do it. And so sometimes it makes people feel worse. Nonetheless, it stood out among the people of Persia for sure that they did keep a separate, or let's say a set of laws on top of whatever the Persian laws may have been. Except, of course, in this case where it offended Haman greatly that Mordecai would not bow to him for whatever Mordecai's reasons were. So verse 9, if it pleases the king, let a decree be written. So after Haman portrays it in the way that he has done, and having the position that he does have, he says, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So I'm not sure if the king heard anything after Haman said 10,000 talents. Because 10,000 talents, without going into exactly what that was a great sum of money, and probably in the millions of dollars of today's dollars, and maybe multiple millions of today's dollars. And so after he said that to the king, okay, let's say blah, 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 these people not keeping my laws, let's destroy them. I'll give you the money. So it's not even an issue. We'll make this a non-issue. So now there's nothing to stop the king from issuing this decree that Haman's proposing, because number one, they are lawbreakers and they are going against the king, and it's not going to cost the king any money. I will fund it. So it also shows you how wealthy Haman was also at that time. So somebody else is going to pay for it. What's stopping you? So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So if he certainly wasn't an enemy before, just say perhaps as an Amalekite, he definitely was one now because of this plan that he wants to put into motion. And the king willingly goes along with it. In fact, not only does he give him this signet ring, but it's a promotion as well, as we'll read in chapter 5 and verse 11. And it wasn't a signet ring just for this one occasion, but it was something that he kept with him until the end of his life, which we'll see in chapter 8 and verse 2 as well. So he gets this promotion for who knows what reason. And in terms of, if it was the money or if it was, that he had these great ideas, nonetheless, life is going great for Haman. His plan is coming together and he is on the king's good side. So the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. So it's sealed with the ring. It's got the king's stamp of approval. And what the king says goes. It's the law, and not even the king can go against that. So just a little side note, some people take this to mean that the money is given to you, meaning that the king actually gave him the money. But no, if you look at Esther 4 verse 7 and 7 verse 4, you'll see that I think those two verses make it pretty clear that Haman gave him the money. Haman paid for all of this. And so it seems to be more of like, okay, if that's what you want to do with the money, then go ahead. Kind of like, kind of give him some kind of tacit approval here where he says, Oh, yeah, okay, I'll give you the money. Well, Haman was supposed to give it to him, and he was giving back what was Haman's. Anyway, any way you look at it, the other two verses, I think, show that Haman eventually paid for what he was going to do. So now Haman had this free hand. Okay, he got the king's approval to go and do what he wanted to do. Now, continuing in verse 12, the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. Okay, so another day in the chronology. And a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus, it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. So when Haman did this, it was just as though the king was doing it. So it could not be any more powerful or any more binding than what it was that he sent out. And the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to plunder their possessions. So it was, again, to throw the Purim. They found out this day, which is now 11 months later. And not only are they going to kill them, but then they're going to take all their possessions. And again, it may have been a zero-sum game, or who knows, he may have come out even way ahead in terms of the 10,000 talents of silver that he had given. So maybe this was kind of a no-brainer for Haman, that he would end up getting his money back anyway. Now, a copy of the document was to be issued as law, very binding, in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day, this day that's going to come around March of 473 BC. Continuing in verse 15, the couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. So the king and Haman sit down as if to toast what they're doing, their actions, and perhaps, pat each other on the back and say, this is a great plan, and they're all happy because king's got 10,000 more talents, and which was, again, a considerable sum, even for what the king would collect normally even in a year. This was even not more than that, but a very large portion of that amount of money. So it goes on and says that those in Shushan, though, were somewhat perplexed because, again, I don't want to read too much between the lines, but here it is, this thing, this law, this edict, this decree goes out, and it's just kind of just very quickly now the blue, so seemingly, that all of a sudden, let's kill all the Jews. And so they're wondering and thinking, why? I mean, we're perplexed as to why the king would do this. And again, it doesn't necessarily say if they suspected or knew it was Haman per se, but nonetheless, it had the power and the weight of the king, and was signed in his name with his signet ring. So, you might lead us to wonder how much the king was actually then privy to in terms of what Haman was doing, or how much leeway he gave Haman because he trusted Haman. But nonetheless, the decree was issued, and it had to be because of the trust that he already had in Haman. Now, continuing to chapter 4, Esther 4. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out of the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went out as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So everything's happening very quickly now. We're still in the same time setting as we were in the previous chapter here, and could very well be very, very close proximity to that as well. And what we see is that everyone reacts to it very quickly, specifically the Jews we're talking about. They immediately began putting on the sackcloth and sitting in ashes, and they fasted. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to throw in here. Why does anyone fast? Okay, you always have a reason to fast. And so what we see here is God in the picture once again. The Jews, and again, you can make a whole sermon on fasting, but the Jews, and this is what they're instructed to do, fasted to beseech God's will and to plead with him their case. And so what we see right here is God in the story, that they were fasting to a God, to the one and only God, the true God. So again, what we have to do when we see this, we have to answer that question as to why this was happening. So again, what we see is that God's hand is in the process, and the people, the Jews, are soliciting his intervention in this whole plan. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, so she apparently did not know yet, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So here she is, the queen of Persia, and she really doesn't have this access that you would think to the goings and comings, the knowledge of what the king was doing, much less what Haman had sent out to all the provinces. So she was kept in the dark. And again, what we will find out is that she could not just go before the king to find these things out, as we'll see in chapter 4, this chapter, and verse 11 here. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. All right, so again, this is where Mordecai typically hung around anyway, but it was within the king's gate. Verse 7. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasury to destroy the Jews. This is one of the verses we quoted ahead of time. So what we see is that Haman paid, and he paid for their destruction. He gave a price to basically, to the king, so that he could kill these people who didn't keep the law, the Jews. Now, it also shows, too, to a certain degree, that Mordecai was in a position to have even more knowledge, possibly, than what was issued in the edict. Again, who promoted him? How did he get to that position? Continuing in verse 8. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. Excuse me. Now, so again, Mordecai had these connections, again, no doubt because of this promotion that he got back that we referenced back in chapter 2, verse 19. So now, Mordecai sees a way out of this. He sees a plan that could possibly work to, again, divert Haman and his plan from killing all the Jews. And of course, that way is through Esther. So he gives her all the info and the background. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther told Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. So after reading it, what he had sent her, and assessing and somewhat digesting the information, this is her reply. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So what we see here then is this reticence on the part of Esther to go in and plead the case of the Jews before the king, because it carried with it this potential threat of death, or potential of death. It was a threat for sure, that if she was to go into it, then, if he did not extend this scepter to her, then she would be killed. And it was obviously not beyond the king to do this, depending on the mood that he was in. Continuing in Esther 4 and verse 12. Esther 4 and verse 12. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai told them to Esther. He told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews." So again, this confirms her reluctance there in verse 11, that, okay, Mordecai is reading that from what he's being told, that she's hesitant to go and do this because of the threat of death and the fact that she hadn't even been in to see the king in 30 days and a whole month. So perhaps in her mind there was, this thought that she was not in favor with the king for some reason. Now, again, we have to remember the king's law, what the king's law is, and how it's under threat of death, and that the king will do whatever the law is. And we have to remember Daniel too. Even when the king didn't want to kill Daniel back in Daniel 6, that he was forced to throw him into the lion's den because it was the law of the Medes and Persians, which was not alterable. So as much as it would displease the king, okay, if this order went out from Haman, right? If it went out that all the Jews had to be killed, and it was his signet, and it was his ring, it was his law that he put out, his word, he would be forced to kill Esther, just as his prior predecessor was forced to throw Daniel, as much as he liked him, into the lion's den. It was the law. So Mordecai is just trying to give her a reality check, saying, look, you're going to be on the line, and perhaps even more so because you're in a position to do something about it. And he goes on in verse 14 and says something along those lines. He says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, as it has so many times in the past. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." So Mordecai kind of ups it another step here. He's saying you have the responsibility to do what is right in this situation. If you don't, then there are, cursings that come with this, and God will save the Jews some other way. But if you don't, or if you do, then it really does seem that this is why God has done all the things that we have seen from the beginning of the chapter, from the beginning of the book until now, that he was doing it for this reason. And of course now this seems to be very obvious. Maybe we're looking at it in hindsight and we're going, okay, yeah, it's this Monday morning quarterbacking, which is 2020. But to me, this really does seem very obvious. And I think this is exactly what God was doing with this young, orphaned Jewish girl. So when you look at what her state was before, you really have no other conclusion that you can come to other than God is in the picture, and he's the one that's orchestrating events, and that he got her to this position, did not tell anybody that she was a Jew, put Mordecai in the positions that he was, gave Esther all the favor in front of the king to this end, for this purpose. So continuing in chapter 4, verse 15, Esther, now pricked in her heart because of what Mordecai has said and God working with her, told them to reply to Mordecai, Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So again, we see the fasting, the reaching out to God. So he's in the picture. But even though there's no mention of him, the intervention in their lives, though hidden, is conspicuous and indisputable. And finally, verse 17 of chapter 4. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him to do. So now continuing in Esther chapter 5. Now it happened on the 3rd day of fasting that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. So what we have to understand here is that Esther now was willing to sacrifice herself for the Jews. So for 3 days now, she doesn't know whether she is going to live or die. In some respects, she's just as good as dead if the king does not extend the scepter out to her. So it was, verse 2, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his head. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. I mean, what a relief that had to be. And that it appears he did it very quickly, so there was no doubt that she had been granted favor both with God and the king. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom." Now, I think this is somewhat of an idiomatic phrase, but it's something along the lines that, tell me your request and I will do my utmost best to grant it. So again, I don't know that literally half the kingdom was up for grabs, but nonetheless, it does show how willing he was to grant her whatever it was that she asked. So Esther answered in verse 4, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." So Esther had a plan and she had thought it through, and the banquet was not what she was requesting. Again, we'll see that the king knew that, but it was merely a segue or a transition into the request that she was going to make. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. You can only imagine at this point how Haman is feeling. And the king's, already agreed. He's found favor. And again, he picked her to be queen for a reason. So nonetheless, he's anxious to go, and he goes say, "Go get Haman very quickly." And now Haman's going, "Okay, yeah, I'm me and the king, we're buddies and we're going, and the queen even likes me." That's how great things are for me and how well things are going. So at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." So we see again that the banquet was not the actual request. And Esther said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So why exactly does she not do this? Why is it that she does another banquet? Again, the reason is unclear. We can only guess and conjecture as to why she did a second banquet. And I'm not even going to get into what the possible ideas are for that, except to say that God had his hand in this, and he had his reasons for doing this, some of which we will see a little later. So once again, we're not let into what everyone's thinking or why they're doing what we're doing. And again, I think it's so that we put our focus where it should be, and that is on God working behind the scenes. So continuing, Esther 5 and verse 9. So Haman went out that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So here we have Mordecai with all this wealth, power, status, position, all this favor, about to go to a banquet with the king, specifically invited by the queen as well. And he's got everything, just turning up roses. And he walks past Mordecai and he becomes indignant about this one little thing. I think it shows what a petty man Haman was, really, deep down. So with his whole life ahead of him, right, as far as he knew, everything going well, what Mordecai was doing stuck in his craw. Nevertheless, verse 10, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends, and his wife Zeresh. So it's interesting that he restrained himself. There was something that he wanted to say. There's something he probably wanted to do, but he knew what his plan was going forward, and that he would ultimately get his, so to speak. So even though he was dying to, he instead got his friends and his wife to come around, so then he could vent. So he thought it the better part of, well, not valor per se, but in terms of the way he should deal with Mordecai, perhaps in revealing his hand or whatever, for whatever reasons he had to restrain himself. But now he's going to be with his wife and with his family, and he doesn't necessarily restrain himself. So continuing in Esther 5 and verse 11. Then Haman told them, this is wife and friends and family, of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything which the king had promoted him in. So again, we start off at one point and then says, okay, yeah, he promoted him. He advanced him, I think, as the King James Version says. And how he advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides that, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow, so I did that today, and guess what? Tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet, okay, but all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Again, to me, that's the epitome of pettiness. So again, the irony here too is that while Haman is so upset by what Mordecai was doing, he was so pleased with what he thought Esther was doing, and yet they were both Jews. And so again, had he known that she was a Jew, because he hated them all, he would not have, I dare say he would not have gone ahead with his plan. And again, I think this bears it out when we find how the king reacts here in the very end of Haman's life, let's say. So again, what we see then is God's plan yet again in all of this, in the way that Haman's approaching the situation, the way he's thinking about the situation. So had he known that she was a Jew, I don't think he would have been as excited about making the plans that he does in this next verse. Esther 5 and verse 14. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And then the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So again, there's a second banquet. Why a second banquet? Well, there are these things that were going to happen in between. And we see one of them here is that he goes home and he makes a gallows. And he has this made very quickly. Again, I think, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but these gallows weren't necessarily the gallows that we have today or what we think of in terms of gallows, but it was something that obviously could be erected with, I guess, enough money, manpower, and time to actually be able to put it up that day and have it ready for the next day. So again, he is so full of himself here that he's going to do this presumptuously. And then his plan is tomorrow to, beseech the king, because everything is just going so well that surely this won't be a problem. So he had no more of a clue about where his life was going than Esther did as this young, orphaned Jewish virgin girl before she was plucked out of this anonymity and made a queen. So she becomes elevated up to this point that, again, only God could have done it. And conversely, we see the same exact thing happen to Haman, that Haman now is at the epitome of power, second only to the the king of Ahasuerus, who is the king of the world-ruling Persian Empire. It was the preeminent empire in its day, and Haman is number two. Who, and again, this is in the early days of the empire. It would not fall for another 120 years or so. So here we have the empire very healthy, and the number two in this unsaleable position, about to be brought all the way down as far as you can go, which is death. And I think when you look at both of these cases and you contrast them and compare them, you have no choice but to see the unseen God.